Machiavelli once wrote, "He who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation." I learned the brutal truth of this statement the hard way when I almost destroyed my career over a single email I sent while angry. It was March 2021, and I was sitting in my cramped home office during another endless Zoom meeting. My boss, David, had just thrown me under the bus in front of the entire leadership team, blaming me for a project delay that was clearly his fault. I felt my face burning with rage as I watched him smooth talk his way out of responsibility while painting me as incompetent. The moment the call ended, I opened my laptop and started typing the most scathing email of my professional life. I detailed every single one of David's failures over the past 6 months, copied HR, and was about to hit send when something made me pause. Maybe it was the memory of my mentor telling me about the 24-second rule. That's how long it takes for adrenaline to drop by 50% and your rational brain to regain control. I closed the laptop, walked outside, and counted to 24, twice. When I came back, I read what I'd written and felt sick. That email would have ended my career instantly. Instead, I deleted it and wrote a professional response asking for a private meeting to discuss the project timeline. 3 months later, when David's pattern of throwing team members under the bus finally caught up with him, I was promoted to his position. That night taught me something crucial about emotional control that I'd never understood before. Your emotions aren't your enemies. They're unruly soldiers in your personal army. A weak leader lets them run wild and destroy everything. A strong leader trains them to serve a strategic purpose. The difference between those who succeed and those who self-destruct isn't the absence of intense emotions. It's the discipline to pause between feeling and reacting. I started studying people who seemed naturally calm under pressure, and I noticed something interesting. They weren't emotionless robots. They were strategic actors. They felt everything just as intensely as everyone else, but they'd learned to create space between the trigger and the response. Warren Buffett doesn't panic during market crashes, not because he doesn't feel fear, but because he's trained himself to see fear as information, not instruction. The statistics on this are sobering. Research shows that 89% of major career decisions are made while people are in altered emotional states, and most people regret these choices within 6 months. Think about your biggest life mistakes. I'd bet money they happened when you were angry, scared, heartbroken, or euphoric. Our emotions hijack our prefrontal cortex and drop our effective IQ by 30 points for exactly 24 seconds. Now, I practice what I call emotional aikido. When someone tries to provoke me, I don't resist or fight back immediately. I redirect their energy while staying centered myself. Last week, a client tried to bully me into accepting a terrible contract by yelling about deadlines and threatening to take their business elsewhere. Instead of getting defensive, I said calmly, "I understand this is urgent for you. Let me review the terms tonight and call you tomorrow with a solution that works for both of us." That simple pause completely changed the dynamic. The client apologized the next day for his outburst and agreed to my original terms. He later told me that my composure under pressure convinced him I was the right person to handle his high-stress projects. What he saw as unshakable confidence was really just controlled fear. I was terrified of losing that client, but I'd learned not to let terror make my decisions. The truth is, people are constantly testing your emotional discipline, usually without even realizing it. Your boss sees how you handle criticism. Your spouse watches how you react to stress. Your kids observe how you manage disappointment. Every emotional outburst is a small defeat that teaches others they can manipulate you by pushing the right buttons. But here's what really changed everything for me. I realized that emotional control isn't about suppression, it's about transformation. Instead of trying to eliminate anger, I learned to convert it into focused determination. Instead of hiding fear, I transformed it into careful preparation. Instead of avoiding sadness, I channeled it into deeper empathy. Your emotions are raw materials, not final products. The most successful people I know have all mastered this principle in their own way. They've learned to feel everything, show nothing until they choose to, and use their emotional energy as fuel for strategic action rather than impulsive reactions. It's the difference between being driven by your emotions and driving with them. But controlling your own emotions is just the first step in this journey. Once you've mastered your inner world, you begin to realize something fascinating about the outer world. People are constantly broadcasting their emotional states through micro-signals most of us never notice. And that's where things get really interesting. Machiavelli understood that everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. This hit me like a brick wall during my first major presentation as a team lead at a tech startup in Austin back in 2020. I was 29, fresh into management, and about to present our quarterly results to a room full of investors who could make or break our funding round. The numbers were terrible. We'd missed every target by at least 30%. My hands were shaking as I walked into that glass conference room on the 15th floor, knowing I was about to deliver news that could cost 20 people their jobs. But here's what I'd learned from watching my previous boss, Maria, during crisis meetings. What you feel inside doesn't have to match what people see outside. Maria could be having a complete internal meltdown about budget cuts, but she'd walk into meetings with this calm, almost bored expression that made everyone think she had everything under control. It drove me crazy at first, until I realized it was genius. So as I stood in front of those stone-faced investors, I did something that felt completely unnatural. Instead of apologizing or making excuses, I spoke slowly, made eye contact with each person, and even smiled slightly when delivering the bad news. I presented our failures like they were learning experiences we'd planned all along. These results show us exactly where to focus our resources for maximum impact next quarter, I said, as if missing targets by 30% was all part of some master strategy. The weird thing is, it worked. The lead investor actually nodded approvingly and said afterward that he was impressed by how unflappable I seemed under pressure. He told me that most entrepreneurs panic when things go wrong, but I showed executive presence. I wanted to laugh. I'd been terrified the entire time, but my controlled exterior made him see confidence where there was only carefully managed fear. That experience taught me something crucial about human psychology. People judge your competence more by how you appear to handle stress than by your actual results. Mirror neurons in our brains automatically mimic the emotional expressions we see, which means when you look calm, others literally start feeling calmer too. You're not just managing your image, you're programming other people's emotional states. I started paying attention to how successful people manage their emotional masks in different situations. Andy Grove from Intel was famous for maintaining the same neutral expression during company crises, even when he knew about serious problems. His steady demeanor kept thousands of employees calm during industry upheavals. Meanwhile, I watched other leaders destroy their credibility by letting stress show on their faces during tough announcements. The tricky part is knowing which emotions to reveal and when. Last year, during a heated contract negotiation with a major client, I deliberately showed controlled frustration, not anger, but professional disappointment. I said something like, "I'm genuinely surprised this is the direction you want to take, given our history together." That calculated display of emotion actually strengthened my position because it showed I cared without showing weakness. But I've also seen this backfire spectacularly. My friend Jake, who runs a marketing agency in Denver, lost a huge client because he couldn't hide his desperation during a renewal meeting. The client could smell his financial stress, and it made them question whether his company was stable enough to handle their account. Jake felt everything he showed, and it cost him $60,000 in annual revenue. The key insight is that emotional transparency isn't always authentic. Sometimes it's just poor strategy. When you're interviewing for a job, negotiating a deal, or leading a team through difficulties, your emotions become tools, not just feelings. You choose which ones to display based on what outcome you want, not just what you happen to be feeling in the moment. I practice what I call the 3-3 rule before important interactions. I choose 3 emotions I want to project and 3 I want to conceal. Before that investor meeting, I wanted to show confidence, thoughtfulness, and determination while hiding fear, disappointment, and uncertainty. It sounds manipulative, but it's really just emotional leadership, taking responsibility for the emotional climate you create. The fascinating thing about mastering your emotional mask is that it eventually changes how you actually feel. When you consistently project calm confidence, you start developing real calm confidence. Your external performance becomes internal reality. But there's another layer to this game that most people never discover. Learning to read the masks that others are wearing, and that's where things get really dangerous. Machiavelli famously said, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." I never truly understood the strategic power of controlled intimidation until I found myself in a conference room in Chicago, facing down a supplier who was trying to screw over my small manufacturing company. It was September 2019, and our main steel supplier, a company we'd worked with for 3 years, had just informed us they were tripling their prices with only 2 weeks' notice. Their sales manager, a smug guy named Peterson, sat across from me with this arrogant smirk, clearly expecting me to just bend over and accept it. He knew we had a major order due in 30 days and couldn't easily switch suppliers, or so he thought. What Peterson didn't know was that I'd spent the previous month quietly building relationships with 2 alternative suppliers, specifically because I'd sensed his company was getting too comfortable with us. I'd learned this from watching Judge Judy on TV, of all places. She never screams or loses her temper, but she has this way of speaking very quietly and slowly when someone tries to lie to her that's absolutely terrifying. It's controlled intimidation at its finest. So when Peterson finished his little speech about market conditions and unavoidable cost increases, I didn't argue or plead. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, looked him directly in the eyes, and said in the calmest voice possible, "Peterson, I need you to understand something very clearly. We'll be terminating our contract effective immediately. Our lawyers will be in touch about the early termination fees you'll owe us under Section 12 of our agreement." The change in his demeanor was instantaneous. The smirk vanished, his posture shifted, and suddenly he was the one scrambling. "Wait, hold on," he stammered. "Let's not be hasty here. I'm sure we can work something out." But I'd already stood up and was walking toward the door. "I appreciate the 3 years we've worked together," I said without turning around. "Good luck with your market conditions." That calculated display of power, the willingness to walk away combined with complete emotional control, saved my company over $40,000 that year. Peterson called me 3 times that afternoon, eventually offering us a better deal than we'd had before his attempted power play. But I'd already signed with our new supplier, who appreciated customers who knew their own worth. The key lesson here is understanding the difference between toxic aggression and strategic intimidation. Toxic aggression comes from insecurity and emotions running wild. It's what weak people do when they feel cornered. Strategic intimidation comes from a position of actual strength and serves a specific purpose. It's not about making people fear you personally, it's about making them respect the consequences of trying to take advantage of you. I learned this distinction the hard way earlier in my career when I tried to intimidate a coworker who was taking credit for my work. Instead of building a case and addressing it professionally, I confronted him aggressively in front of the whole team. It backfired completely. I looked unprofessional and emotional while he came across as the victim. That's what happens when you use intimidation from weakness instead of strength. The most effective intimidation is often the quietest. Steve Jobs wasn't famous for yelling. He was famous for his deadly calm when someone presented subpar work. Margaret Thatcher didn't need to raise her voice to be called the Iron Lady. True intimidation comes from the certainty that you have other options and the willingness to use them, not from making a lot of noise. But here's the crucial part. Intimidation only works when you actually have the power to back it up. Before that meeting with Peterson, I'd spent weeks building alternative relationships and understanding our contract terms. The intimidation was just the delivery method for real consequences, not a bluff. When you try to intimidate from a position of weakness, people see right through it and you lose all credibility. I now use what I call the iceberg principle. 90% of your power should be invisible preparation, and only 10% should be the visible display. Most people do the opposite. They make a lot of threatening noise while having no real backup plan. That's not intimidation. That's just theater without substance. The beautiful thing about mastering strategic intimidation is that you rarely have to use it. When people sense you have boundaries and the strength to enforce them, they usually choose not to test you. But there's an even more subtle art that complements this power, the ability to make people want to please you without them even realizing why. And that requires understanding something most people never learn about human psychology. Machiavelli wrote that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand. The real power isn't forcing people to feel what you want. It's making them think those feelings were their own idea all along. I discovered this during what should have been the most humiliating moment of my professional life. It was January 2022, and I was pitching a consulting contract to the executive team at a Fortune 500 retail company in Minneapolis. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. My laptop crashed. The projector wouldn't work, and I ended up delivering my entire presentation from handwritten notes while standing awkwardly by a whiteboard. The CMO, Linda, looked openly annoyed, checking her phone every 30 seconds. But instead of panicking or apologizing profusely like my instincts screamed at me to do, I did something counterintuitive. I smiled slightly and said, "You know what? This is actually perfect. The best strategies don't need fancy slides. They need to make sense when you strip away all the bells and whistles." Then I started drawing simple diagrams on the whiteboard, speaking directly to each person as if we were having a casual conversation rather than a formal presentation. Something magical happened in that room. Instead of seeing a failed presentation, they started seeing authenticity and confidence under pressure. Linda put down her phone and leaned forward. The CEO started asking questions and building on my ideas. By the end of the meeting, they weren't just buying my services. They were convinced the whole thing had been planned, that I'd deliberately chosen the low-tech approach to demonstrate my point about simplicity. I walked out with a 6-figure contract, and Linda later told me that my unflappable presence during technical difficulties was what convinced her I could handle their company's high-pressure environment. The truth is, I was terrified the entire time, but I'd learned to channel that energy into focused attention on what they needed to feel, not what I was feeling. This experience taught me something crucial about influence. People don't buy logic, they buy emotions, then use logic to justify their emotional decisions. When you control the emotional climate of an interaction, you're essentially writing the story that people will tell themselves about why they chose to trust you, work with you, or follow your lead. I started studying how master influencers create these emotional experiences. Barack Obama had this ability to make audiences feel hopeful even when discussing serious problems. He'd acknowledge the difficulty, validate people's concerns, then gradually shift the emotional tone toward possibility and action. Reed Hastings from Netflix does something similar with investors. He makes them feel like insiders who understand the long-term vision even when sharing disappointing short-term results. The key is what I call emotional aikido. Instead of pushing against what people are feeling, you acknowledge it, match it briefly, then gently redirect it where you want it to go. Last month, I was mediating a heated dispute between two department heads at a client company. Instead of trying to calm them down immediately, I let them vent for 5 minutes, nodded seriously and said, "I can see you both care deeply about this company's success. That passion is exactly what we need to solve this." Suddenly, their anger transformed into collaborative energy because I'd reframed their emotion as something positive and useful. They stopped seeing each other as obstacles and started seeing themselves as passionate colleagues working toward the same goal. The solution they came up with together was better than anything I could have suggested, and they both felt like heroes for finding it. But here's the subtle part that most people miss. This isn't about manipulation or fake empathy. It's about genuinely understanding what people need to feel in order to make good decisions, then creating the conditions for those feelings to emerge naturally. When done right, everyone wins, because you're helping people access their best selves rather than exploiting their weaknesses. The most powerful influencers I know have mastered this principle. They make people feel seen, understood, and capable of greatness. They don't impose emotions on others. They create space for the right emotions to flourish. It's the difference between being a con artist and being a leader people genuinely want to follow. What's fascinating is that once you understand how to create these positive emotional experiences, you start noticing how other people are trying to influence your emotions every day. And that awareness opens up a whole new level of the game. Learning to read the subtle emotional signals that people broadcast constantly, often without even realizing it. Machiavelli knew that he who wishes to be obeyed must know how to command. But before you can command anyone, you need to read the room, literally. I learned this lesson during a sales call that should have been impossible to win, but became my biggest commission check of the year. It was October 2020, and I was sitting in the sterile conference room of a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey, trying to sell them a software solution they'd already rejected twice. The previous sales reps had focused on features and benefits, doing all the talking, while the decision makers sat there looking bored. I decided to try a completely different approach. I would speak as little as possible and watch everything. Within the first 5 minutes, I'd mapped the entire emotional landscape of that room. The IT director, Mark, kept touching his nose whenever someone mentioned budget, a classic tell that he was stressed about cost overruns from previous projects. The CFO, Patricia, crossed her arms every time Mark spoke, signaling she didn't trust his technical recommendations. The CEO leaned forward whenever I mentioned time savings, but sat back when I talked about features. Instead of launching into my prepared pitch, I started asking questions specifically designed to make each person reveal more about their emotional state. Mark, what's been your biggest challenge with software implementations lately? I watched his shoulders tense as he described a project that went over budget by 40%. Patricia, how do you typically evaluate ROI on technology investments? She uncrossed her arms when discussing measurable outcomes, telling me she needed concrete numbers, not promises. The breakthrough moment came when I noticed the CEO's micro-expressions during our conversation. Every time someone mentioned their competitor gaining market share, his jaw tightened slightly and he blinked more rapidly. Classic signs of anxiety mixed with competitive anger. That's when I realized this wasn't really about software at all. It was about fear of falling behind. So I shifted my entire approach. Instead of selling software features, I started telling a story about how their main competitor had recently streamlined their operations. I mentioned specific time-to-market improvements I'd observed in the industry, watching as the CEO's breathing became more shallow and his attention intensified. I wasn't lying. I was simply choosing which truths to emphasize based on what I was reading in his emotional responses. The magic happened when I started mirroring their emotional states, strategically. With Mark, I adopted a slightly concerned tone when discussing technical risks, validating his expertise. With Patricia, I became more analytical and numbers-focused, matching her need for precision. With the CEO, I let some urgency creep into my voice when discussing competitive threats, amplifying the anxiety he was already feeling. By the end of that meeting, they weren't buying software from me, they were investing in protection against their worst fears. The CEO actually said, "We can't afford not to do this," which is exactly the emotional state I'd been guiding him toward for the entire hour. I walked out with a $200,000 contract that my predecessors couldn't close because they'd been trying to create emotions instead of reading and redirecting the ones that were already there. This experience taught me that most people are constantly broadcasting their emotional states through tiny signals, micro-expressions, body language shifts, changes in vocal tone. It's like everyone's walking around with their internal radio tuned to different emotional frequencies, and most of us are tone-deaf to these signals. But once you learn to tune in, it's like having a superpower. I started practicing this skill everywhere, reading the barista's stress level before ordering my complicated drink, noticing when my girlfriend was actually upset despite saying she was fine, recognizing when my boss was in a good mood before asking for time off. The key is learning to see emotions as information rather than just atmospheric noise. The fascinating thing about becoming fluent in emotional micro-signals is that you realize how much communication happens below the conscious level. People reveal their real thoughts and feelings constantly, but only to those who know how to look. And once you can read these signals reliably, you gain access to something even more powerful, the ability to protect yourself when others try to use these same techniques on you. Machiavelli warned that anyone who wishes to act the part of a good man in all circumstances will bring about his own ruin, for those he deals with will not all be good men. I learned this brutal lesson when I nearly lost my entire savings to someone I trusted completely. It was spring of 2018, and my college roommate Jake called me with the opportunity of a lifetime. He'd started a cryptocurrency trading fund and was generating 30% monthly returns for investors. Jake was my best man, someone I'd known for 15 years, so when he asked me to invest my emergency fund of $25,000, I barely questioned it. Looking back, I can see exactly how he manipulated every one of my emotional triggers. First, he created artificial urgency. I can only take 5 more investors before we close this round permanently. Then he isolated me from other opinions. Don't mention this to anyone else. We're keeping it quiet for regulatory reasons. He attacked my financial insecurity. Man, you're still working that corporate job while guys like us are building real wealth. Finally, he made vague promises. Trust me, this is going to change both our lives. I was about to wire him the money when something made me pause. My mentor from work, David, had once told me about Warren Buffett's approach to investment decisions. Buffett never makes financial choices when he's emotionally excited, and he always runs major decisions past his partner Charlie Munger. I realized I was about to make the biggest financial decision of my life while feeling a cocktail of greed, FOMO, and misplaced loyalty. So I told Jake I needed 24 hours to think about it. His reaction was immediate and telling, frustration mixed with pressure tactics. "Dude, you're overthinking this. By tomorrow, the spots will be filled." That response alone should have been a red flag, but I was still wrestling with doubt. Instead of deciding immediately, I did something that probably saved my financial future. I called two other friends who understood investing and ran the whole scenario past them. Both of them immediately spotted the classic signs of a Ponzi scheme that I'd missed because I was emotionally compromised. 30% monthly returns are mathematically impossible to sustain. Legitimate investment opportunities don't require secrecy, and real friends don't pressure you into financial decisions with artificial deadlines. My emotional attachment to Jake had made me blind to obvious manipulation tactics. When I called Jake back to decline, he went through a predictable cycle. Anger, "You don't trust me after 15 years? Guilt, "I was trying to help you build wealth." And finally dismissal, "Your loss, man." 6 months later, his fund collapsed and several investors lost their life savings. Jake disappeared, and I never heard from him again. That 24-hour pause literally saved me from financial ruin. This experience taught me to build what I call emotional circuit breakers, automatic systems that prevent me from making important decisions while manipulated. Now I have a rule. Any decision involving more than $5,000 requires a 48-hour cooling off period. Any opportunity that can't wait 48 hours isn't an opportunity worth taking. I also learned to recognize the 5 universal red flags of emotional manipulation: artificial urgency, isolation from other opinions, attacks on your self-worth, vague promises of reward, and disproportionate emotional pressure. These tactics work because they exploit our basic human needs for belonging, security, and significance. Once you know the playbook, it becomes much harder for people to run these plays on you. The most important defense I developed is what I call distributed decision-making. Like Warren Buffett with Charlie Munger, I now have a small circle of people I trust to give me straight feedback when I'm considering major choices. They're not emotionally invested in my decisions, so they can spot manipulation tactics that I might miss when I'm in the middle of the situation. Building emotional immunity isn't about becoming cynical or paranoid. It's about staying clear-headed when others are trying to cloud your judgment. The strongest people I know aren't those who never get manipulated. They're those who recognize it quickly and have systems in place to protect themselves. They understand that in a world full of people playing emotional games, having good defenses isn't just smart, it's survival. But there's another layer to this game that goes beyond just protecting yourself from manipulation. Once you understand how these emotional influence tactics work, you start to realize that timing, when you deploy them and when you resist them, can be the difference between success and failure. And mastering that timing requires understanding something most people never think about. Machiavelli understood that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. Timing isn't just about when you act, it's about when you make others feel ready to act. I discovered this during the most important salary negotiation of my career. It was March 2021, and I'd been building a case for promotion at my marketing firm in Seattle for 6 months. I had all the evidence: revenue increases, client testimonials, expanded responsibilities. But every time I thought about scheduling the meeting with my boss, Rachel, something told me to wait. I was unconsciously following what I now call the emotional tide, waiting for the perfect confluence of circumstances. The breakthrough came when I started paying attention to Rachel's energy patterns throughout the week. Monday mornings, she was always stressed about weekend emails. Wednesday afternoons, she was optimistic after our team meetings where we reviewed wins. Friday evenings, she was mentally checked out, already thinking about her weekend plans. But Tuesday mornings around 10 o'clock, after she'd had her second coffee and cleared her urgent emails, she was consistently in her most receptive state. I also realized there was a larger emotional cycle at play. Our agency had just landed a major client in February, and the whole office was riding high on that success. Rachel had been getting congratulated by senior partners, and I could sense her confidence was elevated. This was crucial. People are more generous when they feel successful themselves. 6 months earlier, when we'd lost a big account, would have been emotional suicide for a promotion request. So I waited for the perfect storm. A Tuesday morning at 10:15, 3 days after we'd received positive feedback from our new major client, and exactly 4 hours after Rachel's usual breakfast time, when her glucose levels would be stable. I'd learned that cortisol drops to its lowest point around this time, making people naturally more open to positive conversations. This wasn't just strategy. It was applied biology. When I walked into her office, I could immediately tell the timing was right. She looked up from her computer with a genuine smile instead of the polite but busy expression I usually got. "Perfect timing," she said. "I just finished reading the client feedback from yesterday's presentation. Really strong work." That's when I knew the emotional current was flowing in my direction. Instead of diving straight into my request, I spent the first few minutes amplifying her positive mood. I mentioned specific praise from the client and how her guidance had helped me prepare the presentation. I was essentially raising the emotional temperature of the room before introducing any tension. Only after I saw her lean back in her chair with a satisfied expression did I transition to my promotion request. The conversation flowed naturally because I'd timed it to match her emotional rhythm. She was feeling successful, confident, and appreciated. Exactly the state where generous decisions feel natural rather than forced. When I presented my case, she nodded along instead of looking for reasons to say no. The promotion I'd been building toward for 6 months was approved in a 20-minute conversation. But I've also seen people destroy opportunities through terrible timing. My colleague Mark asked for a raise on the same day our biggest client threatened to leave, when Rachel was visibly stressed and defensive. Another friend, Sarah, brought up relationship issues with her boyfriend right after he'd gotten bad news about his job search. Both situations might have gone differently with better emotional timing. The key insight is that people make decisions based on how they feel in the moment, then use logic to justify those feelings afterward. If you ask for something when someone is feeling generous and optimistic, they'll find reasons to say yes. Ask when they're feeling stressed or defensive, and they'll find reasons to say no, even if your request is identical. I now track what I call the 4-2-1 timing rule for important requests. 4 hours after someone's last meal for stable energy, 2 days after any major stress for emotional recovery, and 1 week after any significant win for maximum positive momentum. It sounds calculated, but it's really just emotional courtesy, asking people to make decisions when they're in the best state to make good ones. The fascinating thing about mastering emotional timing is that it makes you realize how much of human interaction is really about creating the right conditions for positive outcomes. But there's another dimension to this that goes even deeper. Learning to create emotional debts that people actually want to repay. And that requires understanding something most people never think about. Machiavelli advised that benefits should be given little by little so that they may be better enjoyed. The art isn't just in helping people, it's in making them feel genuinely grateful in a way that creates lasting loyalty. I learned this lesson through what started as a simple favor and ended up changing the entire trajectory of my career. It was August 2019. And I was working as a project manager at a consulting firm in Dallas when I noticed something troubling. My colleague Jennifer, who worked in business development, was clearly struggling with a client presentation that could make or break her career. She'd been staying late every night for 2 weeks, looking increasingly frazzled and defeated. Most people in the office pretended not to notice. Office politics meant her failure might benefit their own advancement. But I remembered something my mentor had taught me about Robert Cialdini's principle of reciprocity. An unrequested favor creates 3 times more psychological debt than a favor someone asks for. More importantly, the timing and manner of help determines whether people feel grateful or obligated. I wanted Jennifer to feel empowered, not indebted, because genuine gratitude is far more powerful than reluctant obligation. So instead of offering to help directly, which might have made her feel incompetent, I did something more subtle. I accidentally left a book on presentation design on her desk with a post-it note saying, "Found this helpful for the Morrison account last year. Thought you might enjoy it." No strings attached, no mention of her current struggle, just a casual gesture between colleagues. The next day, Jennifer stopped by my office to thank me. During our conversation, I mentioned that I'd recently taken a course on financial modeling that had some techniques relevant to her client's industry. Again, I framed it as sharing something interesting rather than offering help. "Would you mind if I showed you this one analysis framework? I think you'd have some great insights on how to improve it." What happened next was beautiful to watch. Because I'd approached our interaction as seeking her expertise rather than offering rescue, Jennifer felt valued rather than pitied. She opened up about her presentation challenges, and we ended up collaborating on a solution that was better than either of us could have created alone. She got to present ideas that were genuinely hers, built on foundations we'd developed together. The presentation was a massive success. Jennifer's client signed a $2 million contract, and she was promoted to Senior Business Development Manager within 3 months. But here's the crucial part. She never forgot that I'd been the one to help her during her darkest professional moment, and she did it in a way that preserved her dignity and confidence. 6 months later, when Jennifer heard about an opening for a strategy director position at her previous company, a role that would have taken me years to access through normal channels, she personally recommended me to the hiring manager. That recommendation led to a $40,000 salary increase and put me on a completely different career trajectory. What started as a simple act of strategic generosity had created a loyal advocate in a position to change my life. The key insight is understanding the difference between creating genuine gratitude and manufacturing obligation. When you help someone while making them feel capable and valuable, they want to find ways to return the favor. When you help in a way that makes them feel small or indebted, they secretly resent you even while saying thank you. The goal is to make people feel like the success was theirs, with you playing a supporting role. I now follow what I call the 5-3-1 rule for building reciprocity networks. Remember 5 personal details about each important person in my life. Maintain 3 meaningful touch points per month and offer 1 significant but unrequested favor per year. The key is making these interactions feel natural and relationship-focused rather than transactional. But timing matters enormously in this dance. You can't deposit reciprocity credits right before you need to withdraw them. That feels manipulative. The most powerful favors are those given when you have no immediate need for anything in return. People sense authentic generosity versus strategic positioning, and they respond very differently to each. The beautiful thing about mastering reciprocity is that it creates positive cycles that benefit everyone involved. When you help others succeed while preserving their dignity, you build a network of people who genuinely want to see you succeed. But there's something even more sophisticated at play here: the ability to test and refine these approaches without damaging relationships. And that requires understanding something most people never consider. Machiavelli warned that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done rather walks to his ruin than to his preservation. The most dangerous thing you can do with emotional influence is assume your tactics work without testing them first. I learned this lesson the hard way when I nearly destroyed a crucial business relationship by deploying an untested strategy at the worst possible moment. It was November 2020, and I was preparing for the biggest presentation of my consulting career, a pitch to the board of directors at a healthcare company in Phoenix, worth potentially $300,000 in annual revenue. I'd been studying influence techniques for months and was eager to try what I thought was a sophisticated approach: strategic vulnerability combined with competitive pressure. My plan was to open with a personal story about my grandmother's experience with their healthcare system, then subtly mention that their main competitor had also expressed interest in our services. I'd practiced this approach exactly once with my girlfriend over dinner, and she'd been moved by the story and impressed by my confidence. Based on that single data point, I convinced myself I'd discovered the perfect formula. The presentation was a disaster. The board chairman, Dr. Martinez, visibly stiffened when I started my personal story, clearly viewing it as emotional manipulation rather than authentic connection. When I mentioned their competitor, the CFO actually leaned back and crossed her arms. Classic defensive body language. I'd misread their corporate culture completely. They valued clinical precision and direct communication, not emotional storytelling and veiled threats. I walked out of that room knowing I'd blown a massive opportunity because I'd treated a complex business relationship like a lab experiment without understanding the variables involved. The contract went to a competitor who gave them exactly what they wanted: data, projections, and straightforward problem solving. My untested, sophisticated approach had made me look amateur and manipulative. That failure taught me something crucial about testing influence strategies. You need to start with low-stakes situations where mistakes don't cost you relationships or money. Daniel Kahneman spent 40 years systematically testing psychological principles in controlled environments before applying them to high-stakes decisions. I tried to skip the testing phase and go straight to deployment. So I developed what I call emotional A/B testing, trying different approaches in situations where the outcome doesn't matter much. I started practicing with baristas, hotel front desk staff, and customer service representatives. If I wanted to test whether mirroring someone's energy level improved rapport, I'd try it while ordering coffee, not during a $1 million negotiation. If I wanted to see how strategic pauses affected conversations, I'd experiment during casual networking events. The insights from these low-stakes experiments were revelatory. I discovered that my natural speaking pace was actually too fast for most people to feel comfortable, so they'd unconsciously resist my ideas. I learned that my attempt at confident eye contact was coming across as aggressive staring to introverted personalities. Small adjustments based on real feedback transformed my effectiveness in important situations. One of my most valuable testing grounds became flight delays and service issues, situations where people are stressed, but the relationship doesn't matter long term. I'd experiment with different approaches to getting upgrades, resolving billing issues, or handling complaints. These scenarios taught me which techniques worked with different personality types under stress, knowledge that proved invaluable in business negotiations. The key breakthrough was learning to read real-time feedback rather than assuming my techniques were working. Most people broadcast their comfort level through micro-expressions and body language shifts, but only if you're paying attention. When someone's shoulders tense after you say something, that's data. When they lean forward or make better eye contact, that's also data. I started treating every interaction like a mini experiment. Now I follow a strict testing protocol before using any influence technique in important situations. At least 5 low-stakes trials with different personality types, careful observation of both verbal and non-verbal responses, and honest assessment of what actually worked versus what I hoped would work. This systematic approach has saved me from countless embarrassing mistakes. The beautiful thing about building this testing discipline is that it makes you genuinely better at reading people rather than just better at manipulating them. You start to understand what makes different individuals feel comfortable, respected, and open to collaboration. But there's another level to this game that goes beyond individual interactions, learning to build networks of genuine influence that sustain themselves. And that requires understanding something most people never master. Machiavelli knew that he who has the people as friends will always live with honor. But building a true emotional network isn't about collecting contacts. It's about creating a web of people who genuinely feel invested in your success. I discovered the power of this approach when I transformed from being just another consultant into someone people actively want to help succeed. It was January 2020, and I was struggling to grow my freelance consulting practice in Austin. I had decent skills and good work ethic, but I was competing against established firms with decades of relationships. My approach had been transactional: deliver good work, send invoices, move to the next project. I was basically invisible in my clients' emotional landscape, just another vendor they occasionally needed. Everything changed when I started working with a startup founder named Marcus, who was clearly overwhelmed by the challenge of scaling his tech company. Instead of just focusing on my deliverables, I began paying attention to the emotional weight he was carrying. During our weekly calls, I noticed he'd mentioned stress about hiring decisions, worry about investor relations, and frustration with technical challenges completely outside my scope of work. Most consultants would stick to their lane and ignore these broader concerns. But I realized Marcus wasn't just buying my analytical skills, he was buying peace of mind and strategic confidence. So I started what I called emotional value adds. Small gestures that cost me nothing but made him feel supported as a whole person, not just a client. When Marcus mentioned struggling to find qualified developers, I introduced him to 3 talented engineers from my network, not expecting anything in return. When he was nervous about a board presentation, I spent 30 minutes helping him anticipate difficult questions, even though presentation coaching wasn't in my contract. When he celebrated a product milestone, I sent a thoughtful message acknowledging the specific challenges he'd overcome to get there. The transformation in our relationship was remarkable. Marcus started involving me in strategic discussions far beyond my original scope. He introduced me to other founders in his network as the consultant who actually gets it. Within 6 months, 3 of those introductions had become major clients. More importantly, Marcus became what I now call an emotional advocate, someone who actively looks for opportunities to help you succeed. This experience taught me the difference between professional networking and emotional alliance building. Professional networking is about exchanging business cards and maintaining periodic contact. Emotional alliance building is about making people feel understood, supported, and valued in ways that transcend the immediate business relationship. When done authentically, it creates loyalty that outlasts any single project or transaction. I started applying this approach systematically across my entire network. For each important relationship, I maintained what I call an emotional database, remembering not just professional details, but personal fears, aspirations, family situations, and sources of stress. My assistant thought I was crazy for keeping notes about clients' kids' soccer games and spouses' career changes, but these details became the foundation of genuine connection. The key insight is that most people feel professionally successful, but personally isolated. When you acknowledge their whole human experience, celebrating their wins, supporting them through challenges, remembering what matters to them personally, you fill an emotional need that pure business relationships can't satisfy. This creates a bond that competitors can't easily replicate. I learned to create what I call belonging rituals, small traditions that made people feel part of something special rather than just another business contact. With one client group, I started sending quarterly lessons learned emails highlighting insights from our projects that could benefit the entire network. With another, I organized annual strategy dinners where founders could share challenges and solutions in a trusted environment. The most powerful part of this approach is that it's genuinely sustainable because everyone benefits. I'm not extracting value from people, I'm creating value for an entire ecosystem of relationships. When someone in my network needs help, others actively want to contribute because they feel connected to something larger than individual transactions. But here's what I discovered about building emotional networks. They require constant calibration and protection. Not everyone operates with the same level of authenticity, and learning to defend against those who would exploit your genuine approach becomes crucial. The deeper your emotional connections, the more vulnerable you become to sophisticated manipulation. And that's where the final piece of this puzzle becomes essential. Machiavelli warned that anyone who makes it his business to be good will be ruined among so many who are not good. The deeper you get into understanding emotional influence, the more you realize how many people are constantly trying to use these same techniques against you. I learned this brutal lesson when someone I trusted used my own generosity and emotional openness to nearly destroy my business. It was April 2021, and I was approached by a charismatic business coach named Stephen, who claimed he could help me scale my consulting practice to 7 figures. Stephen had all the credentials: best-selling author, successful entrepreneur, glowing testimonials from recognizable names. More importantly, he seemed to understand my deepest professional insecurities and biggest ambitions better than I understood them myself. Our first conversation should have been a masterclass in manipulation, but I was too emotionally invested to see it clearly. Stephen created artificial urgency by mentioning he only took on 12 clients per year and had 1 spot left. He isolated me from other opinions by suggesting I keep our discussions confidential until I was ready to commit fully. He attacked my self-doubt by pointing out that successful entrepreneurs invest in themselves without hesitation. But the most insidious part was how he made me feel special and understood. He'd researched my background thoroughly and knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. "You're not like other consultants," he told me. "You actually care about creating real value, not just making money. That's rare, and it's why you'll be perfect for my advanced program." I felt seen and validated in a way that bypassed my rational thinking completely. The final manipulation was a combination of social proof and scarcity. Stephen casually mentioned that 2 other consultants I respected had joined his program and were seeing incredible results. Then he offered me a founding member discount that expired in 24 hours. Every red flag I'd learned to recognize was flying in front of my face, but emotional manipulation had effectively blinded me to logical analysis. I was literally reaching for my credit card to pay his $15,000 fee when something made me pause. My mentor David had taught me about Warren Buffett's decision-making process. Never make major financial choices while emotionally excited, and always run important decisions past a trusted advisor. I told Stephen I needed 1 day to think about it, and his reaction was immediate and telling. The mask slipped completely. Stephen went from supportive coach to pressure salesman in seconds. "I'm disappointed," he said. "I thought you were serious about success. By tomorrow, the spot will be gone, and honestly, I'm not sure you'd be a good fit anyway if you can't make decisive moves." That response alone confirmed every suspicion I should have had from the beginning. Instead of deciding immediately, I did what I now call emotional inoculation, I called two other business owners who'd worked with high-level coaches and described Stephen's entire approach without mentioning his name. Both immediately identified classic manipulation tactics: artificial scarcity, isolation from other opinions, emotional flattery designed to bypass rational analysis, and pressure to decide, while emotionally compromised. When I researched Stephen more thoroughly, I discovered a pattern of former clients who'd had similar experiences: initial promises, followed by mediocre results, and difficulty getting refunds. The recognizable testimonials were either fabricated or taken from a different context entirely. I'd almost lost $15,000 to someone who'd systematically studied my psychological profile and crafted an approach specifically designed to exploit my emotional vulnerabilities. This experience taught me to develop what I call the 5 red flags protocol for identifying emotional manipulation. Artificial urgency that can't wait for proper consideration, attempts to isolate you from other perspectives, appeals to your ego or insecurities designed to bypass logic, vague promises with no measurable outcomes, and disproportionate emotional pressure for relatively simple decisions. I now practice distributed decision-making for anything important, running major choices past people who aren't emotionally invested in the outcome, and can spot manipulation tactics I might miss when I'm in the middle of the situation. I also built in mandatory cooling-off periods: 24 hours for any purchase over $1,000, 48 hours for business investments, and 1 week for major life decisions. The most important defense I developed is what I call manipulation immunity through exposure, deliberately putting myself in low-stakes situations where people try to influence me, so I can practice recognizing and resisting these techniques. Timeshare presentations, high-pressure sales calls, and aggressive fundraising appeals all become training opportunities to strengthen my psychological defenses. But the ultimate insight from this experience is that the same emotional intelligence that makes you better at influencing others also makes you more attractive as a target for sophisticated manipulators. The deeper you understand human psychology, the more important it becomes to protect yourself from those who would use that knowledge against you. And that protection requires integrating everything we've learned into a coherent philosophy of emotional mastery. Machiavelli wrote that fortune is the arbiter of half our actions, but she still leaves the control of the other half to us. After 2 years of studying, testing, and applying these principles of emotional mastery, I've learned that true power comes not from controlling others, but from becoming the director of your own emotional reality and the architect of positive dynamics around you. The transformation in my life has been profound and measurable. My consulting business grew from struggling freelancer to a team of 8 people generating over $2 million annually. My relationships became deeper and more authentic because I learned to create emotional value rather than just extract it. Most importantly, I developed what I call emotional sovereignty, the ability to stay centered and strategic regardless of what chaos swirls around me. But the real test of these principles came last month when everything I'd built was threatened simultaneously. A major client representing 40% of our revenue decided to terminate their contract due to budget cuts. My business partner of 3 years wanted to dissolve our partnership to pursue a different opportunity, and my girlfriend of 2 years told me she was considering a job offer in another city that would end our relationship. 2 years ago, I would have handled this crisis with pure emotion: panic about the business, anger at my partner, desperation to convince my girlfriend to stay. Instead, I found myself applying every principle we've explored in a coordinated response that turned potential disaster into opportunity. The integration of these lessons had become second nature, like muscle memory for emotional intelligence. With the client situation, I used the timing principles we discussed. waiting until their stress about budget announcements had passed before scheduling a conversation. I employed emotional mirroring to match their concern about cost efficiency, then redirected toward the value we provided. Instead of defending our existing contract, I proposed a restructured arrangement that actually saved them money while maintaining our core relationship. They signed immediately. For my business partner, I applied the reciprocity principles by focusing on his success rather than my own concerns. I spent 2 hours understanding his new vision and even offered to help him transition smoothly, preserving our friendship while protecting business interests. He was so impressed by my response that he connected me with 3 potential clients before leaving, more than replacing the revenue gap his departure would have created. The relationship situation required the most sophisticated application of everything I'd learned. Instead of trying to convince my girlfriend to turn down the opportunity, I used the influence techniques to help her think through what she really wanted. I asked questions that helped her realize the job offer wasn't aligned with her long-term goals, while making it clear I supported whatever decision would make her happiest. She ultimately chose to stay, but more importantly, our relationship strengthened because she felt truly heard and supported. What struck me most about navigating this crisis was how natural these responses had become. The pause before reacting, the ability to read emotional undercurrents, the skill of redirecting conversations toward positive outcomes, all of it flowed together as an integrated approach to human interaction. I wasn't manipulating people. I was creating conditions where everyone could make better decisions. The key insight from this experience is that emotional mastery isn't about becoming a manipulation machine or losing your humanity. It's about developing the emotional intelligence to understand what people need to feel in order to access their best selves, then creating those conditions naturally. When you master this balance, influence becomes service and power becomes responsibility. I now operate from what I call the Emotional Prince Code. 6 principles that integrate everything we've explored. Master yourself before attempting to influence others. Read emotional currents before trying to redirect them. Time your moves to match natural rhythms rather than force artificial urgency. Build genuine value for your network rather than extracting it. Test your approaches in low-stakes situations before deploying them in important relationships. Defend your emotional sovereignty while remaining open to authentic connection. Looking back, the most important lesson isn't any single technique or strategy. It's understanding that emotional intelligence is a form of leadership that serves everyone involved. When you help people feel understood, valued, and empowered to make good decisions, you create positive ripple effects that extend far beyond your immediate goals. You become someone others genuinely want to succeed because your success creates value for everyone around you. The journey from emotional reactivity to emotional mastery has been the most valuable investment I've ever made in myself. It's changed not just how I handle business challenges, but how I show up in every relationship and interaction. I've become the kind of person I always wanted to be, calm under pressure, influential without being manipulative, successful while remaining genuinely caring about others' well-being. The beautiful thing about mastering these principles is that they compound over time. Each authentic connection strengthens your network. Every crisis handled with emotional intelligence builds your reputation. Every person whose success you genuinely support becomes an advocate for your own growth. You become living proof that true power comes not from dominating others, but from elevating them while you rise.